One of the highlights of my time in seminary was working with Dr. Vincent Harding. By then retired as Professor of Religion and Social Transformation, Dr. Harding, along with his niece and his daughter, ran the Veterans of Hope Project, a community-based educational initiative on religion, culture, and participatory democracy. And he was a regular guest lecturer in various seminary classes. Though he didn't lecture, he would start a class by playing a piece of music, usually something recorded by Sweet Honey in the Rock, and then, kindly and with genuine curiosity, he would simply ask questions. We hoped, of course, to learn from Dr. Harding's great wisdom and experience, and that's why I was thrilled to work with him. I was essentially his assistant, working next to him in the Veterans of Hope offices, organizing decades worth of his files, running the occasional errand for him, and helping to organize a spoken word poetry jam with Denver High School students. Dr. Harding loved spending time with young people, asking them questions, listening with his whole attention to their answers, and always treating everyone as his sister or brother in the purest example of respecting the inherent worth and dignity of all people that I have ever witnessed. I refer to our first principle, but Dr. Harding wasn't a UU. He was a Mennonite, having been so impressed by the Anabaptist history of commitment to nonviolence that he left behind his upbringing and even ministry as a Seventh-day Adventist to join the Mennonite Church in Chicago. It was there, too, that he met Rosemary Freeney, whom he credits with the gentle Socratic method that he used in teaching. In 1960, they were married in the middle of a very significant few years in their lives. In 1958, Dr. Harding and some fellow Mennonites went on a road trip across the South to witness to the civil rights movement, including an unplanned and unannounced stop to see Martin Luther King Jr. in Montgomery. Nevertheless, Coretta Scott King greeted them warmly at the door, and Dr. King, who was recovering from being stabbed, I might add, was apparently glad to sit up in his bed to meet the travelers. That visit concluded with Dr. King saying, "You Mennonites understand what we're trying to do in this nonviolent movement. You ought to come down from Chicago and help us." Dr. Harding didn't forget that invitation, and from it grew a lifelong relationship. In 1961, the Hardings moved to Atlanta to join the civil rights movement as representatives of the Mennonite Church, and they regularly worked with Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, including helping to organize the March on Washington. Dr. Harding also drafted Dr. King's landmark anti-war speech at Riverside Church, Beyond Vietnam. In one of his books, Dr. Harding describes the significance of nonviolence to those struggling for freedom and peace even decades later. In the late 1980s, the Hardings were invited to go to West Germany and meet with some of the U.S. military personnel stationed there, many of them people of color who had enlisted because military service offered them better pay, a sense of dignity, and paradoxically greater safety than civilian life. One afternoon, Dr. Harding met with a large group in their company chapel for a presentation on Dr. King, and they talked about the Birmingham, Alabama campaign of 1963. As Dr. Harding writes, two of the young black women in the chapel had grown up in Birmingham during those years, and they helped recreate the feeling of the situation, reminding us of the city's well-earned nickname, Bombingham, because of its record of violent attempts at intimidation, especially against any black initiative for justice. Recollecting that danger, I asked, When King and the SCLC were invited by the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth to come to this violently segregated city to challenge its unjust ways, how many guns did they take with them? I could feel, Dr. Harding continues, the sudden pause in the movement of the conversation. I watched with questioning eyes, almost heard them saying within, "What are you talking about? Are you crazy, mister?" Aloud, several people declared at once, "No guns, they didn't carry any guns." It was an exciting moment for a teacher whose students were all wearing US Army uniforms. Pressing them into the logic of their own announcement, I said, "What do you mean they had no guns? How could they go into that violent city without guns? Aren't we taught here that you meet violence with violence, that you have to talk the language that people understand?" I continued the questions. "Aren't we taught here that you have to fight fire with fire?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then, out of the eloquent silence, Dr. Harding remembers, a young black woman sitting up front spoke slowly, thoughtfully, emphatically. "You don't fight fire with fire," she said. "You fight fire with water." From his Seventh-day Adventist upbringing in a community of immigrants from Barbados, with its emphasis on black empowerment and social activism, to his embrace of nonviolence as a Mennonite, Dr. Harding firmly believed that both could go hand in hand, that racial equality and justice could be achieved through nonviolent means. And as it turns out, when they first met in 1958, this was fresh on Dr. King's mind too. Before his recovery at home in Montgomery, Dr. King was in hospital in New York City, which is where he'd been doing a book signing when he was stabbed. And in that hospital, he was visited by Howard Thurman. Both of them Black Baptist ministers. They had met briefly before. For one thing, Thurman became dean of Marsh Chapel at Boston University when King was a PhD student there. But in New York, the elder theologian gave the young activist some important advice, that Dr. King should take the opportunity of recuperating from his near-fatal injury to rest his body and mind, to step aside from the immediate struggle, to reflect on his life and purpose, and only then to move forward. Dr. King took that advice very seriously, and he found new strength in understanding that spirituality is an essential part of social transformation, particularly the commitment to nonviolence. This was something that Thurman learned, in turn, thanks to the influence of another activist. It was in 1935 that Thurman traveled to India, where he met Mohandas Gandhi, leader of the campaign for Indian independence from the British Empire. This was long remembered by Thurman as a central event in his life, particularly since at the end of their meeting, Gandhi reportedly said that he regretted not having made nonviolence more visible as a worldwide practice, and mused that perhaps it would be through African Americans and their struggle for justice and freedom that the unadulterated message of nonviolence will be delivered to the world. Thurman took that to heart, and it was something that Dr. King and others repeated during the Civil Rights Movement. Now, ahimsa is the ancient Indian principle of nonviolence, so that wasn't anything new for Gandhi. It was while he was a lawyer in South Africa, though, that he began a correspondence with Leo Tolstoy. The Russian author supported Indian independence, believing that it would happen through the non-violent application of the principle of love. One of Tolstoy's non-fiction books influenced Gandhi in particular, leaving an abiding impression on him and deeply influencing the form of activism that he was developing. Entitled "The Kingdom of God is Within You," that book condemns violence and nationalism, particularly religious naturalism, and describes a society based instead on non-violence and universal love. And where did Tolstoy get that title? Well, it comes from the Bible, from the New Testament book named for Luke. Once Jesus was asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God was coming, and he answered, "The kingdom of God is not coming with things that can be observed, nor will they say, 'Look, here it is,' or 'there it is,' for in fact the kingdom of God is among you." The kingdom of God, or sometimes the kingdom of heaven, is something that, according to the New Testament, Jesus talked about a lot. According to these two verses, it's not something that's coming, but something that in some way is already here. Now, there's no consensus among scholars as to what the phrase means exactly, but it doesn't seem to refer to some afterlife. Rather, it seems to refer to the way that the world should work if everything were the way it should be, with justice and peace, according to, as Tolstoy put it, the principle of love. And so it stands to reason you can't get there through violence. This has been on my mind in recent weeks, thanks to the juxtaposition of two photographs. You've probably seen these two pictures side by side as well. There's the photograph of row upon row of armored police officers projecting maximum intimidation in response to a peaceful Black Lives Matter protest last summer. And then there's the photograph of the violent mob breaking into the US Capitol on January 6th. It's said that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but these two pictures, especially the painfully obvious contrast between them, could stand in for an entire doctoral thesis. There is no more clear demonstration of the role of white supremacy in our society than, on the one hand, the extreme police response to demands for racial justice that are still, as Dr. Harding would have recognized, based on Dr. King's practice of nonviolence, versus, on the other hand, the lack of preparation, indeed the lethal lack of preparation, in the face of white nationalists and other right-wing extremists who were known to be planning violence in the ex-president's name. I don't like simplistic binaries, and I especially don't like taking sides. But when it comes to comparing a peaceful demonstration and a violent insurrection, one is clearly right, and one is clearly wrong. You can't get to the kingdom of God, a world of justice and peace, according to the principle of love. You just can't get there through violence. Last Sunday, my colleague, the Reverend Sherman Logan, preached on reimagining the beloved community for the 21st century. The beloved community, which was also popularized by Dr. King, is another term for the kingdom of God, certainly as understood by Unitarian Universalists. Here's how Reverend Sherman put it. I envision a reimagined beloved community as a place where all people feel welcomed and included, a place where we love each other for our uniqueness despite our differences and through our disagreements. In this community, we find our comfort and our common humanity in constructing new bridges to meet each other when our communication breaks down. We stand up for each other and have each other's backs. We defend one another. We are in solidarity together. And there is a place for compassion, forgiveness, and grace for all of us, even the worst of us, because we know that sometimes the worst can be found deep inside all of us. In the beloved community, no one is left out. No one's more powerful than another. We are all treated equitably and equally. I don't know about you, Reverend Sherman concluded, but that's the beloved community that I can imagine. And I'll add, I don't know about you, but that's the beloved community where I long for us to live. If that's the beloved community as Reverend Sherman describes it, if that's the kingdom of God, then of course violence has no place in it. So if we want to create the beloved community, we have to start being the beloved community. To me, the kingdom of God is among you means two things. First, it's not going to come magically from some other place at which we can point, some place outside ourselves. There's no deus ex machina that will miraculously save us from ourselves. And second, the only way we can enter it is by acting and behaving and living as if we were already in it. For Dr. King, the beloved community was the goal, and nonviolence was the means. And that's not surprising because they're the same thing. Let me put this another way. For me, the end goal of religion, all religion, is beloved community. Sure, there's lots of other stuff that's accreted around that in every religion, but for me, the beloved community is what religion is really all about. Indeed, the word religion comes from Latin words meaning to join back together. Now, that doesn't mean that I believe at some mythical time in the past there was some golden age when everything was perfect and everyone lived in harmony. But when it comes to human relationships, our relationships with one another, our communities, and the world in which we live, there's a lot that needs to be joined back together. And the opposite of joining together, of course, is breaking apart, which is violence. For Unitarian Universalists, we might think of this in terms of our seventh principle, which names the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Violence is anything that damages the interdependent web and breaks its threads. Religion is about retying those threads, mending the web and strengthening it. The healthier the interdependent web, the stronger our connections, the more the beloved community grows. I'm going to leave the final word on the subject to Dr. Vincent Harding. For those of us who are tempted, and who is not, to doubt that such things are possible, for ourselves, for others, for our nation, we are helped as we try to remember to break out of our larger amnesia. For all of our best religious and spiritual traditions in the human family carry the same supportive message. We are not alone in this struggle for the recreation of our own lives and the life of our community. May we always remember that it is so.